The workplace is changing fast. As an L&D team, how do you build a learning culture, develop the next generation of leaders, and transform your business in an increasingly digital world? Connect your leaders to the world's biggest thinkers with Big Think Plus. Get smarter, faster, with over 1,200 video-based micro-learning lessons designed to level up your learners. Featuring more than 500 experts, executives, authors, athletes, and intellectuals at the top of their field. Across 21 capabilities for the 21st century, from leadership, management, and executive presence to critical thinking, innovation, health and wellness, DEI, sales, and more. Big Think Plus brings you premium instructionally designed video lessons paired with practical tools to optimize learning, create a culture of practice, and enable conversations across your workforce. To make our content come to life in your organization, we offer unlimited curation support, reporting and analytics, subtitles in multiple languages, seamless integration into any LMS or LXP, and a fixed-fee enterprise-wide model. We can't wait to explore all the ways Big Think Plus can make your organization smarter, faster. Let us help you build, develop, transform with Big Think Plus.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Big Think Plus book club. We are very excited to continue this book club series with top authors and thought leaders in the business community and beyond. A few quick notes before we get started. Today's conversation will be 1 hour, ending around the top of the hour. And we want this to be an interactive conversation. So to remind you, to ask a question, you can do so in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen under the Events tab. To introduce today's author, we are very excited to have Tiffany Bova joining us today. To introduce you to Tiffany, Tiffany is a growth strategist and 2 times Wall Street Journal best-selling author. Ranked for the last 6 years in the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50, Tiffany is a leading thinker who Forbes says reshapes our perception of growth. As both a practitioner and academic, she offers a unique perspective and has helped lead the tech industry through several evolutions over her nearly 30-year career as Salesforce former growth and innovation evangelist, and previously as a research fellow at Gartner and a sales, marketing, and customer service executive for startups and Fortune 500 companies alike. Her first Wall Street Journal bestselling book is titled Growth IQ, but today we'll be discussing her most recent book, The Experience Mindset. Before I welcome Tiffany to the conversation today, I'd like to share a quick preview of the video we released with Tiffany a few months back, previewing her full course on The Experience Mindset. So I'd love to share that with you now.
Look, your employees spend 1/3 of their lives, 90,000 hours at this thing called work. But unfortunately, a majority of employees are dissatisfied. When we crossed the threshold into the digital revolution, we found ourselves really trying to reduce the effort for customer, and unfortunately, the effort for the employee went up. In the end, we saw the Great Resignation, and now we have quiet quitting. So many organizations are asking employees for more, but they're giving them less. It makes you quickly realize employees are stressed, employees are burnt out. So how do we fix this problem? My name is Tiffany Bova. I'm the author of the Wall Street Journal bestselling book, The Experience Mindset.
So with great excitement, I welcome Tiffany to the conversation today. Welcome, Tiffany.
Hello, everybody. Thrilled to be here.
How are you doing today? We are excited to have you.
I'm doing great. It's so fun to watch that video and the cut. I remember the day we filmed it and sort of all the excitement around it. So it's exciting to see it finally come to life.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for two main reasons from a personal standpoint. One, you yourself are a host. You host a very successful podcast, What's Next? So I have a lot to learn from you from a hosting standpoint. And also, I'm very excited in reading your book. I noticed a lot of very exciting references to other companies and case studies, which popped up a lot in your first book, in Growth IQ. And also in this book, I noticed the names of Chip Conley, who was our last book club author on our last book club. You referenced him in an employee experience experiment that he hosted at Airbnb, and also a lovely quote from Roger Martin at the beginning of chapter 2, who was also a book club guest. So it was great to kind of see worlds colliding there. So very exciting from that standpoint. So great to have you with us today. We will dig right into it because I know there's a lot to cover. But just kind of to elaborate on the introduction, I know your resume speaks for itself, but you have a very robust background as not only obviously an author as of late, but also with Fortune 500 companies and startups, and kind of as both an academic and a practitioner. So I'm curious just to hear, with everything that you've been working on throughout your career and also what you're working on right now, what's exciting you most about, first of all, all the research that you did with this book, and also what you've been working on as of late.
Well, a couple things. Look, I've been in and around the technology sector for almost 30 years. I started as a quota carrying sales rep a long time ago, 1996-ish. I sold my first domain name to a company in 1997. I was running the US's largest web hosting company, sales, marketing, and customer service in 2000. We were sort of 4 times the size of Rackspace, which tends to be, one of the larger over the last sort of 2 decades. And I was a Loquist beta client. I was Constant Contacts beta client. So I was very early in this thing called the World Wide Web, obviously now called cloud and everything that goes along with it. So I had a front row seat to it from a sales, marketing, and service standpoint. And then spending a decade at Gartner advising companies on how to deal with all this disruption from very small organizations, somewhere could be an EMEA or ASEAN APAC or even LATAM, that their struggles were very similar to a Fortune 10 company, multinational, global, out of the US. The difference was scale, money, resources, right? The obvious things. But that commonality started to get me to focus in on, okay, hold on a second. If the challenges are the same, how could we create something that delivers a framework, if you will, for companies to use as they are either looking to scale and accelerate or recover from a slowdown? And so that was really the genesis for the first book, Growth IQ, which was 10 Paths to Growth. And mind you, in a full transparent mea culpa, I missed employee experience completely in my first book. I think I mentioned employee like 5 or 6 times. But then during my time at Salesforce, which was almost 8 years, I really got a front row seat there on the power of people and culture in its ability to drive tremendous innovation and growth to create this sort of fastest growing enterprise software company in the world, and the 3rd largest software company now, I think. So it was an interesting transition, right? Doing then sort of, being a academic at Gartner, and then kind of doing and being an academic again a second time at Salesforce. But because of that, it led me to the research, which then led me to the second book, The Experience Mindset.
Awesome. That's certainly great to hear. And I'd love to hear, I guess, just to dig straight into it. Now that kind of we've laid the groundwork of what led you to writing the book and how your career evolved into writing the book, I'd love to kind of link the two and talk about, the headlines that we've seen around kind of, and which a lot of this was based around the preview of the video that I just showed and the clip that we showed. The headlines that we've seen around the unhappy employees, burnout, and the sentiment around employee disengagement for a few years now, and kind of what this leads to with the sentiment of employee engagement and disengagement, and the experience mindset and what we're seeing there. So the lockdowns that began in 2020 seemed to place the sentiment under a microscope, and it soon became clear that the topic wasn't just kind of headline fodder, but more so a sentiment that was really showing that there is a disconnect between employee and employer right now. So what are the current conditions leading to this disconnect that you noticed both when you were writing this book and that continue to exist right now?
Yeah, listen, it was sort of back in 2008. I was part of a team at Gartner that made the prediction that the chief marketing officer would spend more on technology than the chief information officer. And when we said that back in 2008, everyone thought we were crazy. But the reason we said it was we believed that the experience customers were having or going to have with brands was going to become as important as the products and services being sold. Now, we didn't know how far that might go, but we believed that customer experience was going to be this new competitive battleground that brands would compete against each other on. And so billions of dollars over the course of, sort of 15 or 16 years were poured into improving customer experience. Like I mentioned, I was very early in the cloud. Back then it was like 8 clicks to buy something, and then it was the magic number was 3, and then it became 1 click, and then it became, voice. And then it was, 2-day delivery, 1-day delivery, same day delivery, 2-hour delivery. I mean, this acceleration of expectation for customers is not slowing down. With all that, companies, large and small, have spent a ton of money to reduce the effort a customer has to put in, like on the things I just said, right? How easy is it to order and or get a product or service? And they lifted and shifted that effort, unfortunately, over to the employee. So even though it might have been 1 click for a customer, it's like 90 clicks for the employee, right? It's 1 application for the customer. It might be 8 applications for the employee. And when the pandemic hit and lockdown happened, and all of a sudden a majority of people started working from home, it sort of shined a light on the lack of investments we had been making over time. And we, as sort of the royal we, right? We had been making as businesses for our employees to make their lives better, make the effort they have to put into their day-to-day work easier, and making less friction in the things they have to do in order to complete the tasks they're being paid to do. And once that started to show itself, companies were scrambling to fix a lot of those things that were then, to use your words, right, and that we talked about in the video series, is you saw burnout, right? And then you saw the result was sort of the great resignation. And then from that, it was sort of quiet quitting. And people were like, look, I'm working harder, not smarter, right? There's no joy in what I do. And my leaders and my managers are not making it easier for me, and they're not listening to me. And that, unfortunately, was the platform by which the experience mindset really showed up. Because when you saw companies that understood the connection, intuitively you understand happy employee, happy customer, get that right, greater growth rate. Like, it's painfully obvious, but then why isn't everyone doing it? And that's where the examples I gave from Airbnb and others on how those organizations really understood it, then actioned it, and then the results they saw from it were so meaningful that they said, we are absolutely on the right track.
Speaking of Airbnb, I'd love for you to just provide that example, as we mentioned, from Chip Conley. Could you, and sorry, just to quickly jump in here, if I seem a little distracted, we've had a quick technical issue, but for those that are here, if you could just join on the LinkedIn Live stream for those that are having any technical difficulties with RingCentral, you can go to the Big Think Plus page. The LinkedIn Live stream is working, and we're shooting a link through in the chat right now. So for those that are having any difficulties, just join us on the Big Think Plus LinkedIn page, and you'll be able to join us there. So sorry about that for anyone that's had any difficulties on the RingCentral side of things. So sorry, just to circle back there. I wanted to talk to and kind of to circle back to and elaborate on kind of the why of what's causing the disconnect. There was a quote that you referenced from an Edelman study around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, And I believe the quote was around how the pandemic reminded every company that they are in the people business, kind of no matter the industry, like they're in the people business. And I think that really underscores the importance that employees really are at the heart of every company. And that's kind of a theme that runs through every chapter of your book. And so can you kind of speak more to the why that's causing this disconnect and kind of deconstruct some of the greatest areas of employee dissatisfaction that you're seeing?
Yeah, that quote from Edelman was also part of a larger study. They do something called the Trust Barometer every year. And for the 10 years prior, customer had been the number one stakeholder for long-term growth and success of organizations. But for the first time, employee popped to number one. And that was sort of 2021, I think, or the end of 21, beginning of 22. And so that just shows that all of a sudden it's like, well, hold on, customer sort of front and center to becoming more employee centric and going back to what you were just saying, Hannah, right? That it became everybody's in the people business, not
Mhm.
just customer satisfaction business, right? Of putting the customer at the center. And that mindset shift, right, was really starting to show itself in, okay, companies are doing wellness, right? Time off, work from home, flex schedules,
Mhm.
investing more in mental health, doing things for family and daycare, really trying to rally around the employees, even though they were not, if you will, in the four walls of the office, right? It could have been because they were working from home. What worries me now is you've started to see some companies snap back to those old behaviors. It's not just about going back to the office, but it could be actually eliminating some of those perks, if you will, or benefits that were being offered during that 2.5 year time or 3 year time. How do you make sure that you keep taking care of employees, even though something as really life changing as that 2 years was, or 2.5 years, depending on where you are in the world, right, is mostly behind us. And so I think that it's important that putting the people at the center or getting back to being people business is
Mhm.
really understanding, what does that mean? Like, if you're listening to this and you're an executive or a manager, like, what does that mean to you? And if you said it to another manager or an executive upstream, or even to your people who report to you, what does that mean? Would everyone agree to what that means? And if you don't even have agreement of what a strong employee experience looks like, or a customer experience looks like, how do you set priorities? How do people choose what to do when faced with a decision, a priority decision, or we could either do this or do that? And if you don't have agreement on what does a great employee experience look like or customer experience look like, how do you make those decisions? And because you don't even have the foundational fundamentals in place, like a definition or a KPI, right? A key performance indicator or a metric, how can you possibly say that you are people led, right? Or you're people focused, or you're people centric, or even on the flip side, on the customer side. So it's sometimes just the basics that people think, oh, yeah, we've got that. They may even say we have a really great culture, or we're a great place to work, according to surveys.
Mhm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean everybody is aligned and everybody knows what's going on. So, to your question, what were the areas of the biggest disconnect? The biggest disconnect between the C-suite and employees was outdated technology. 52% of executives believe the technology they're using is working effectively, which for us with smart math, like quick, that means 48% know the technology they have deployed isn't working effectively.
Mhm.
Then in the general employee base, 32% of employees agree with that statement. So already between the C-suite and the general employee population, there's a 20-point difference in the wrong direction. But when you start talking about customer-facing employees, you're like 20%, 21, 22% agree with that statement, that the technology that's deployed allows them to work effectively, collaborate easily, and get their work done. So, oh my goodness, customer-facing drives revenue. And so
Mhm.
if you're talking about growth and you're talking about disconnect, technology is one area that tons of investment, but very little understanding of how it is actually being used in the hands of the employees.
And technology is an area I'm excited to dig into a little bit later. Um, but I'd love to dig into a little bit more, this term of burnout. Obviously, a very trendy term. We've seen it for a few years now. And I'd like to quote another statistic that you shared, and this was a staggering statistic that I found. And you noted that the lack of engagement costs the global economy 7.8 trillion in lost productivity each year. So can you walk us through the statistic? Where exactly is this showing up in the workplace?
Yeah, and that number, since the book published, it's moved now to 8.1 trillion.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's not going down.
Yeah.
It's not going down. Right. Some of it is work isn't done as quickly. So then products don't get out the door, right? And if products don't get out the door, then revenue dips for the company. When you start talking about implications and how this manifests itself, I'll give you an example. So there was a client I was working with some months ago, middle of last year, and they said that it took 22 minutes to do a return on a product. Okay. So it's a call center agent. 22 minutes to do a return, rough math is you could do 3 an hour. But in reality, their metric was they should be doing like 18 to 20 calls in an hour. So right away, that person was underperforming. Now, underperforming and then getting in trouble, how does that make them feel? Right? Like they're not supported. Wait, hold on a second. It's taking me 22 minutes to do a return. I can't get to 18 or 20 calls because it takes me too long. So if the systems and tools are not integrated and they're having to hop between one tool and another tool, the switching time and the switching cost in the brain actually costs humans almost 4 hours a week. I mean, it's insane amount of time wasted on that kind of switching, going back to tech, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you have that lack of ability of a human to deliver on what a customer needs, and then that human is not able to take another call or upsell or cross sell or finish a task, that's all lost productivity. And in lost productivity, there's an equal side on the other side of that same coin on revenue. And so if they're not able to perform, there is always an implication, not just in people impact, but in revenue impact. So if I am less interested, I'm disengaged, because I only, I've got one more return, right? That's not very motivating, all of those things. It's like, then I'm not going to go the extra mile. I'm not going to want to collaborate with team members. I'm not going to want to necessarily, work even harder to help the customer. I'm just going to do whatever it is I need to do in order to clock in and clock out and receive that paycheck, which is the definition really of quiet quitting, right? That I'm there, but I'm not really engaged. And so that loss of, while I appreciate that massive number, right? $8 trillion, it just manifests itself all over the place. Attrition of people, right? Engagement, joy at work, commitment to the company, trust. And then on the customer side, their loyalty, their experience, their recency of purchase, their share of wallet. I mean, it just starts to show itself across the business all up on both internal and external metrics. So I wouldn't be surprised if that number was higher. But even when you say that number, it's almost so overwhelming that people don't go, almost, Hannah, to your question, where is that even coming from? And how much leak do I have in my business because of this lack of engagement with my employees? That's the question that should be asked, not, wait, tell me how they came up with that number, right? It's like, well, hold on a second. Like, if it's even $100,000 if you're a small business, or $1 million if you're a small business, or a couple $1,000,000 if you're a medium-sized business, or it could be, $250 million if you're a massive organization, it's worthwhile digging into.
Definitely. And this group definitely loves an actionable takeaway. And so I'd love for you to talk to us about Unilever as an example of investing in employees and seeing kind of the return on investment there, and how it paid off for them in the long term. So can we hear a little bit more about their story and how that worked for them?
Yeah, listen, when I used to sell very large technology deployments, and back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, I might have been selling a $2 to $5 million technology project. And back then, that was massive. And without fail, there was always scope creep. There was always change orders. It always took longer than they thought it was going to take. And in the end, when the budget came under scrutiny, what was cut was training. And so we've now just sort of deployed all this new technology, and the people who are intended to use it have not been trained on how to use it. And so then the client would come back 6 months later, 8 months later and be like, "Oh, we're not getting the value out of this." It's like, well, we cut the training budget. And so people are struggling to actually know how to use what we've just deployed and you've spent millions of dollars on. So how do we get the training done? And mind you, this is long before, the big thinks and the online learning platforms. So people had to sit in the class, right? Or read a book or listen to a lecture. It isn't like that now. You can just in time go and search on YouTube and figure out how to do something, right? But back then you didn't have those,
Yeah.
didn't have those opportunities, right? So that was always something I kept an eye on. And so when you find an organization like a Unilever who is absolutely committed to training its managers, because I will tell you again, personally, a high performing sales rep, which I was, the reward for that is you go into sales management. But
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily mean I knew, and I'm speaking about myself here, I knew how to be a manager. Honestly, I was a terrible manager because I didn't know how to manage, right? I didn't know what I was really doing. And maybe 4 years into my management career, I finally went to a management class. And
Mhm.
so the average time between promotion and a class on how to be a manager, like how to run a one-on-one, how to communicate, right? How to show empathy, how to overcome objections, like how to motivate and coach and teach and train. And oh yeah, do your job, right? Those are two very different things, the soft skills and the hard skills of what it means to be a leader and a manager. Um, and so when you have someone like Unilever, which totally focused in on management training because they believed at the middle that it was going to have the greatest impact, right? Executive team, middle management, individual contributors. So they wanted to train the next generation of leaders, but they started at the top of the leadership layer. And they started to notice that the performance in those divisions exponentially improved. So they said, well, if we're going to do it for this layer of manager, let's go down a layer. And then they saw improvement. If we're going to do that layer of management, let's go down a layer. And they kept making those investments. And then they just said, we're going to open it up. And if you want to move within Unilever between, groups, divisions, teams, here is a path by which you can learn and get trained and get coached and apply then for these other positions. So they started seeing, instead of people leaving to go get other careers or to learn new skills or even possibly to make more money, that they were staying inside and seeing themselves have a career progression across a much longer time horizon. And so the improvements there were massive, but it was happening simultaneously with all the other things they were doing. They really moved into that people-centric business. Paul
Mhm.
Pullman, their CEO at the time, was absolutely focused on sustainability and DE&I and ESG goals, and then this investment in people. All of those things started to happen at the same time, and their growth rates showed that that was the right decision for them.
That's great. So we've already been digging into the employee experience and the importance of investing in your people. Obviously, as showcased by Unilever is one example, and you have many more great examples in the book here. I've marked a lot of them, as you can see. But how does this tie together with the customer experience? I know you've obviously been already talking about this, but can we get kind of the pure definition of the experience mindset? Would love to just hear your full takeaway. And for anyone that perhaps joined a few minutes late or didn't catch the beginning, what is the experience mindset?
So I'll say it in a sentence. The fastest way to get customers to love your brand is to get employees to love their job. That's probably the fastest way for me to define the book.
Mm-hmm.
But when I say that, people are like, well, what does love your job mean? Right? Like, I can't put a metric behind love, right? Like, it's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's hard to track and manage and measure, et cetera. So love in this particular conversation would be I find joy in what I do. I'm challenged. I see a career path. I feel like my company invests in me. I trust my leaders. I trust the company to do what they say and say what they do. I see C-suite alignment. I feel like I have the tools and technology I need to be successful. Like all of those things play a part in the human employee's ability to serve that customer. Because in the end, a spreadsheet, a PowerPoint, a vision statement, a poster on the wall does not show up to help a customer. They're great things to have, but a human shows up to serve a customer. Now, if you're saying, well, there's so much automation going on now, and humans
Mhm.
are doing less and less of that tactical, menial tasks. Sure, but humans are the ones that design the automation and the AI. And so if they're doing it with a bias of, I don't like my job, I'm not happy, like I don't care, it might be half done, or it might be done in a way that isn't helpful to employees. It might even be detrimental, and not maybe intentionally, but subconsciously they're so disengaged at work that they just put a half effort in, and the half effort has huge implications to the remainder of the employees. So when we first did the research, I went and shared it with executives around the globe, and probably about 35 or 40 roundtables with sort of a dozen or so executives on each of them. And I consistently heard these three questions. And this is about sort of the experience mindset, right? One, if it's so obvious, why isn't everyone doing it? Because happy employee, happy customer, pretty obvious. You get those two things right, greater growth. And it also, I'm not the first to say it. I'm not the first to say it. However, through our research, we're one of the first to prove it, direct connection and correlation, which there's a difference between understanding that it's true and the obviousness of it, and then, actually being able to prove what pieces and parts. The second is who owns it, which is a very fixed mindset comment. Who owns it means, oh, if nobody owns it, then we can't do it. And if someone owns it, then we need a leader and a group and a division, i.e., another silo, right? Another sort of finger in the pie of, oh, we're going to overcomplicate this. So the third was, what's the return on the investment? If I have $1 to spend, am I going to spend it on a customer? Am I going to spend it on an employee? Where am I going to get the greatest return? That is why I said to call it mindset. So Liz Wiseman, who wrote the book Multiplier, and I were having a conversation, and I was explaining to her the research, and she said something back to me, and I said, no, Liz, really, what I'm trying to say is this is absolutely about having an experience mindset. And I went, oh, stop. Like that's the title of the book, because it wasn't about more investment or doing things, differently in, the technology or the organizational structure. It was shifting the mindset to say, if you are going to make a decision for your customers, and whatever that decision is, product, service, technology, interfaces, websites, tools, apps, anything for customer, what is the intended or unintended consequence for your employee? And today, people don't ask that. They run hard and fast to customer, and they forget about the implication for employee. And so an example in the book I gave was a bank who surveyed their customers, and they said, we want video calls with our high wealth, for high wealth clients for their banking resources. Bank said, great, easy. Like we could turn that on pretty quick. So, it's a very short project. They did it. They pushed out video, right? And said, okay, like this is going to turn on Monday morning. But what didn't they do? They didn't train anybody on how to actually run a video call with them, what to capture, what to say, how to, record the video, save the video, attach it to their file. Is that what they're supposed to be doing? Not everybody that was home working had high-speed internet or had cameras. It was a whole thing. So basically they checked the box for customer, but left the employee in such a state that the service was awful. So they shut it down. And then the customers were like, that was terrible. So then they did it right the second time, relaunched it. But guess what happened? All the customers were like, oh, I tried that once. It was terrible. I'll never do it again. But in reality, it was much better this time. But because it was so bad the first time, it really impacted the experience of the customer, and the employees felt like the company just completely set them up for failure. So had someone said, hold on a second, that's great, we're doing that for the customer. How are we training and enabling, and what technologies and tools and systems are our people going to need and use in order to deliver what we've just promised and committed to our customer? If someone had just asked that question, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And that's why I call it a mindset and not some new, strategic, play on. It's just, you have to get yourself to think of experience as one single coin. One side is customer, one side is employee, and there should always be connected in some way.
Fantastic. I love that visual of a coin. I appreciate you laying that out for us. Thank you very much. To move on to your thinking around a strong corporate culture, you note in your book that growth begins and ends with a healthy a healthy company culture. And I think sometimes it's often hard for us to recognize our own weaknesses and identify those weaknesses, and kind of objectively evaluate ourselves. So how do we take a step back and make those evaluations? And I guess if I was listening in on this call, as a manager thinking about this for my team, or as a leader thinking about this for my company, how would you suggest that you go about making those evaluations and making those decisions and thinking about how to evaluate my company culture?
It's a great question, right? Because culture is one of those things, like, what is a culture? Who sets the culture?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that word love, like, right? How do you measure it?
Broad.
So yeah, it's a very big thing. It's a big statement. We have a great culture. Okay, if you think you do, what do your employees say, right? And then they'll say, oh, well, we survey, and our culture scores are way up, or we're a great place to work, etc. Well, there's a number of great places to work that maybe don't have happy customers. You may have really happy customers and employees aren't happy. One doesn't necessarily beget the other. But when you're asking this question, I always push back and say, please tell me, in your last employee survey, what were your top 5 findings? And you can tell immediately what the questions are. Like, would you recommend this as a great place to work, right? Do you enjoy your job? Are you planning on leaving in the next 12 months? Like, all those things that are, if you will, fairly culture oriented, right? Or company oriented. Instead of asking the questions that we've been talking about for the last half hour, like, do you have all the training you need to do your job? Do you have the right systems and tools? Are the processes supporting what you need to do, i.e., 22 minutes to do a return? If you're not going to ask those kinds of questions, then the culture is sort of the frosting on the cake, but you don't know what's happening in the body of it, right? Like, what are the ingredients of everything that makes up the actual cake itself versus the frosting on top, which sometimes, if employees are disengaged, they're just saying, I'm just going to check all the boxes because that's what they want to hear, and I'm going to move on because I don't care, right?
And
I
it's
have
easier for me to just click,
click, right?
Mhm.
So I'll say, what were, the findings from your last survey? Now, interestingly enough, through the research that we did in anticipation, right, of producing the reports and then ultimately the book, majority of companies in the high 80% range, everybody surveys, 88% said they don't know what to do with the data they collect. So they're collecting data, they're asking for it, and then they don't know what to do with it. And worse off, if they don't know what to do with it, it means they're not actioning it, which then means, as an employee, it's like, well, you asked me, I took the time to answer, nothing changed. So next time you ask me, I'm just going to check all the boxes. It doesn't matter because no one's looking anyway. And if they're looking, they're not doing anything. But you'll see organizations say, oh, well, we're up 2 points, or we're seeing steady improvement on engagement at work, because they're asking those very sort of, the icing questions. They're not getting into what are the mechanics of each and every role, and are we giving them what they need? Now, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, we do a corporate survey and I don't have any say in that, then do one for your team. Ask 2 or 3 very easy, simple questions. If there's one process we could fix that would give you time back, what would it be, right? If there's something that you don't have that you need to make yourself more efficient or effective at work, what would that be? If there's one thing we could do for you to help you serve our clients better, what would that be? Like, I'm not guessing those tend to be the standard questions on the employee survey.
Mhm.
So going back to culture, strong cultures will ask the hard questions, and then they will capture that information, and then they will, in a transparent way, say, we have work to do. Here's what we're going to do now. Here's what we're going to do in the short term. And oh, by the way, here's what we're not going to do and why we're not going to do it. Now, all of a sudden, the employees go, well, I might not agree with the fact they're not going to do it, but now I know why. It's just like when you have small kids and you tell them to do something, they're not very happy. They ask why, right? And you tell them why. They may not be happy with it, but
Mhm.
ultimately it's like, well, okay, that's why I have to clean my room, right? Or brush
Mhm.
my teeth. Like
Yeah.
ultimately, like that's what you need them to do, but you've told them why, and they may not like it, but at least they understand. And then if there's things you want to change, giving time horizons. Now, what has happened is your employees go, wait a second, they asked, I answered, they shared the results, and then they told us what they were going to do. Hmm, I have greater trust. I feel like there's greater transparency. I feel like my leaders are listening to me. Then what happens to engagement? Engagement goes up. What
Yeah.
happens to culture? Culture gets better. What happens to their appreciation for work? They love their job more. Now the soft stuff starts to show up, right? But if
Mhm.
you're not doing those things, it's sending the opposite message, which is we don't care. If you leave, we'll just hire someone else, which was a very pre pandemic attitude. And
Mhm.
then now that's not, right? People are starving for talent. They may have open roles. They may not have people, applying for work. They may have open positions for long periods of time. They may have high performing talent leaving. They may be, only retaining mediocre talent. I mean, that happens if the reverse of what we were just talking about in the culture is not as strong as executives think it is.
That's great. And there were 5 elements that you discuss in your book. And I know we obviously don't have too much time today, so we don't have to touch on all 5, but you mentioned 5 key elements to a healthy company culture. Um, would you like to touch on those 5 or perhaps dig into one or so of those today? But could you share perhaps what you learned from digging into and kind of classifying those different areas of what makes up a healthy company culture?
Yeah, well, I've almost talked about all of them, right? We talked about
Mhm.
trust.
Yep.
We talked about career development, right? We talked about that. We talked about outdated technology, like seamless technology was one of them, right?
Mhm.
C-suite alignment, that agreement of what is the definition. I mean, I think we've kind of covered the 5.
Mhm.
But I would say to you that to be really clear here, to be really clear, I am not a people expert. I am not a culture expert. I'm a growth expert, and so I am talking about when I talk about the experience mindset, I am talking about at that moment that matters when an employee touches a customer in some way, that moment that matters is the sort of the basis of the experience mindset. So while compensation and DE&I and equity and all those things are very important, not necessarily covered in this book. It is really about those employees that touch a customer in some way. Now you may say that is, that is uh, uh, sales, customer service, or delivery or service and marketing. You may say it's those, but then you could say, well, hold on, whoever develops the packaging for our product, that touches a customer. Who designs the website, that touches a customer, right? Whoever designs the FAQs, that touches a customer. So touching a customer is pretty much everybody in the organization in some way. Finance, what the bill looks like, what it says on the bill, the information on the bill, like that touches a customer. So at that moment that matters, that is where the experience mindset is really focused. And so, because that's why I said, right, fastest way to get customer to love the brand is get employees to love the job. That is that intersection, the same side of the experience coin. It is that when those two come together in some way. So while we're talking about culture and while we're talking about people, I just want to make sure that I give a huge asterisk that there's a lot of things this book does not talk about when it comes to people and culture, that it really leans into how do we ensure that employees feel like they have what they need to serve and deliver on the promises we've made to our customers, right? And our stakeholders, our shareholders, our community, our ecosystem, whatever term or word you use. So those things really show themselves in revenue,
Yeah.
profitability, stock, the options and stock price if you're public, your ability to attract and retain talent, like all of those things come into play. But I want to just clarify that's what I'm talking about here.
Great. Last question or two from me. And just as a reminder, and for the folks that joined via LinkedIn, feel free to comment on the LinkedIn event and we'll see your questions that way. Again, we apologize for the tech issues on the Bring Central side, but if you comment on LinkedIn, we'll see your questions that way. So technology, one of the key foundational elements here that we've discussed. And you're an advocate, obviously through the book and through the conversation today, that this is one of the most effective ways to support employees, keep them engaged, and kind of provide them with the right tools to train and support them. And you're in good company today, as we do have a lot of folks who are leadership development experts, learning and development experts who are huge advocates for and from learning backgrounds and would support and work on programs supporting their employees, which obviously a lot of that comes through the use of technology. So to quote a statistic from your book, you noted that only 2 in 10, so 20% of customer-facing employees strongly agree that their company is providing great technology that is seamless or helps them collaborate easily. So how can leaders solve this disconnect and cut out these types of inefficiencies?
Yeah, and this is the heart of the second point I raised when I said I was doing the roundtables, right? If it's so obvious, why isn't everyone doing it? The second was who owns it. So let me just double click on the who owns it, because for those of you listening in that are in the learning and development part of your organization and you're listening to this, you're like, I only have so much control over, right, what I can offer to employees or what they're able to do. I don't have visibility into where they actually need help. And that's why the story for Airbnb really highlighted a recommendation that came out of the book was having an employee advisory board. And so when things are actually being changed in the company, that it goes through this EAB, employee advisory board. And that employee board needs to be individual contributors, can't be executives, right? And really shouldn't kind of be director level and above. Could be maybe a manager, but you don't want anybody in there who has a title of control in any way. Individual contributor, much better. Then what they could raise is, that sounds great, but we need to make sure that we connect processes or systems and we get training before this rolls out. Right. And so learning and development can get plugged in, but that's only part of it. You would need IT to get involved because we need to make sure we integrate multiple systems so data is being shared back and forth and the employee is not having to enter information in 2 or 3 systems, which opens the door for inaccurate information, right? Or inaccurate data. But learning and development is like, I have no control over what IT does. And IT is like, I don't have any control over what learning and development does. And then a particular division like customer service may say, and I don't have any control over what systems and tools are chosen. So now all of a sudden, nobody owns it. Nobody owns it. So learning and development, you have an opportunity to say, I'm going to do a survey that's just about learning and development, because that's one of those levers, right? Career development was one of those 5 things that drives into culture, and find out. And I would make it a pulse survey where it might be 1 question a week or 3 questions a month, and maybe start in teams and then learn and adjust and keep going. But asking them, do they know how to use the systems and tools that they work in every day? If there was 1 class that they could use, or do or take or get help with, what would it be? If you have first-time managers, like using that Unilever story, like that is non-negotiable. They need to learn the soft skills, because their lack of management, the old adage, people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And bad managers are maybe bad managers, not because they're bad managers, but because they don't know how to be a good manager. Again, talking about myself, right? That if I could go back and be a manager now, I feel fairly confident I would be better manager than I was, 20 years ago, hopefully. But that's because I've spent a lot of time learning about, what that means to do. So if you can do that and take that information and go find a buddy, right, in IT or in the groups that you need to get on board, and you can create your own little advisory board on just upskilling or reskilling or level setting, to make sure people have what they need to use all this new systems and tools that are coming at us. It used to be there was one or two, three projects a year that were technology based in an organization. Now there's more than 12 a year. Humans can't absorb that much change that fast. It's not possible. And
Mhm.
so, where and how are you going to flex back and say, I can't train these people fast enough for them to absorb everything you're throwing at them, which means you're not getting the return on that investment. And so, don't feel like you don't have a voice. Find an ally. By the way, HR doesn't own this either. So if you're in the HR group, right, or the people organization, this requires a multifunctional, collaborative, cross-team planning to get to the heart of where could you make these investments in training your people so that they have what they need, to be successful. More importantly, find joy in what they do. As the video intro of me talking about 90,000 hours of your life, 1/3 of your life, hopefully you find joy in 1/3 of
Mhm.
your life, right? Which is this thing called work. And learning and development has a big role to play there.
Yeah. I love the idea of the employee advisory board that you mentioned in this section of your book. I think especially with this notion of new technology and how learning and development professionals and folks who are supporting their teams, or managers or leaders supporting their teams, especially as we see such an influx of new technology coming at us with such rapid advancing speed. I know certainly just from my perspective, there are new technologies coming in at such a vast and rapid speed that many of them are very, very helpful on a day-to-day basis, but there's such a vast and fast influx of them coming in. So it's always great to have ways to cope and deal with how to learn how to use these new skills and how we can use them to onboard and learn how. I really like that section of your book. Okay. A question here that I actually got via direct message. How can I best solicit feedback from my team when they're feeling burnout and stress, or are unhappy with new policies or changes to work, changes?
Yeah. So if you're a manager and you do a one-on-one, in the first 10 minutes of your one-on-one, this is where you ask those questions. You do your check-ins, you make sure everybody, is okay. If there's, anything they may need beyond the administrative side of work, right? That kind of, whether it's mental health, whether it's training, whether it's time off, whether they're feeling burnt out or stressed, whatever it might be. This is where you really have to lean into your empathy. And if you don't know how to ask those questions, this may be something you go to your manager and say, look, I want to be better during my one-on-ones and really doing these touch bases. It will not be like you do it the first time and you're like, oh my God, that was so easy. Everyone was so willing to share. I mean, it will take time for you to earn that trust, especially if you've never behaved that way before with your people. It will take time. The best thing to do is to share your own stories. Like, I'm feeling burnt out. This is what I'm doing, or this is what I've been thinking, or this is what I did, or who I went to talk to. If you can connect with them in that way, it goes a long way. So that may be one thing. You could, if you use something like Slack, you could start a Slack channel with just the team where it's a very safe space. You need to have that psychological safety. And so where they can post things like, I'm feeling burnt out, and someone may come in and go, hey, I'm happy to give you some help. If you want to take the afternoon off, let me know if there's something I can cover for you. Like, all of a sudden the team will start to rally together if they believe that everyone is doing it for the betterment of the overall team. That takes time to build, right? Trust takes time, but it takes just moments to to get rid of, right? And to really destroy all the work that you do. So if you're going to do it, you have to stay committed to it. Whether you watch something on Big Think on psychological safety, whether you go to your leaders and figure out what's the best way to ask those questions, how to set up a Slack channel or how to do a pulse survey. I think technology based is less personal than the one-on-one. And so I think you should combine it with like a Slack channel and your one-on-ones. But as a manager, it will not come naturally to you unless you tend to be a fairly self-aware and empathetic person who is a really good asker of questions, which by the way, that's a rarity. Like, I mean, like only, I think 15% of humans are self-aware according to research. So you may think you're self-aware, only 15% are. And then, are you empathetic? Maybe sometimes, maybe at home and not at work. I don't know. Right. And then are you a really good asker of questions? And then be an incredible listener. And so those are skills you have to develop as a leader if you expect your people to represent you and the organization in that same way. You have to show them, don't just tell them.
Yeah, great. Well, for the sake of time, I want to ask you our final question, which we ask all of our book club guests. And that is, if you could recommend 3 books from either a personal or a professional standpoint, what would those 3 books be and why?
I only have to turn around. So I would say, I would say anything by Nancy Duarte. So I'd say illuminate or resonate if you want to be a better storyteller. And she has a new book called Data Story. Anything by her for just being a better storyteller. Anything by Seth Godin, because he's just one of my favorite humans.
I've got Seth Godin on mine.
Yep. So I've got his big book there. He endorsed my first book. He's a cover quote on my first book.
Didn't you recently?
Yeah, I've had him a bunch of times. He's just, I've known him since 2000, 2001. So I've known him for a bit. But my favorite book of his is Purple Cow. It's still one I always go back to. In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters, which is the very first business book I ever read. And all the way back in like 1985. I didn't really read it in 85, but I got it in 85. And I think I read it around 90. And then he wrote the foreword to The Experience Mindset. So that was a full circle moment for me. First business book I ever read, last endorsement he ever gave. And now that he's retired. And then I'd say Made to Stick was an excellent book of how to communicate better. I'm all about that connection, communication, storytelling, excellence. The business book that is a deep, strategy book. They're good to read. Don't get me wrong. And then of course, anything by Roger Martin, Play to Win. He endorsed my book as well. He's been a mentor of mine for a number of years. So those would be the ones I would say.
Fantastic. I've got Roger on my top shelf up there too. I've got A New Way to Think was his book, on book one here. So fantastic. Well, just in the nick of time, we're wrapping up. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you'd like to watch a recording of this conversation, you can do so at bigthink.com/events. We'll also be emailing this out along with information on Tiffany's book, website, podcast, and everything else. So look out for that email. But Tiffany, thank you very, very much for your time and insights today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Hannah. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I saw some of the questions we didn't get to. I'll try to jump in after and answer them. So thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.